just briefly introduce Professor Sunil Mani to everyone here. Professor Sunil Mani, Director of Center for Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram. Dr. Mani is a Chair Professor of Niti Aayog Unit on Planning and Development at CDS. Formerly, he was a faculty member and head of the Graduate Studies at the United Nations University Institute for New Technologies in Netherlands. He obtained his MPhil and PhD in economics from JNU, New Delhi, and has done postdoctoral research at the University of Oxford on a fellowship from the Ford Foundation, New York. He has held visiting professorships at National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, Tokyo, Japan, Bocconi University, Milan, Italy, and other places. He is also currently serving as a member on the International Advisory Steering Committee to Center for Science, Technology and Innovation Indicators of the Human Science Research Council of the Republic of South Africa and the National Science, Technology and Innovation Policy Office, Thailand. Further, he serves on the editorial boards of two international journals of repute, Research Policy, which is published by Elsevier, and International Journal of Technology and Globalization, which is a part of the InterSign network. We're extremely happy, sir. We look forward to have and hear from you. We have requested sir to deliver the invited lecture on Science, Technology and Innovation for Sustainable Growth in India. And I request Dr. Janaki to present a bouquet to sir and welcome him onto the dais.
Before Dr. Janaki comes and Professor Sunil Mani comes to dais, we are very proud of the fact that Professor Sunil Mani has taken over as Director of the Center for Development Studies, which was set up by Dr. K.N. Raj, who is so well known, I think, everywhere in the world. And Professor Sunil Mani has brought a great glory to the Institute. Professor Sunil Mani was also at IPE, and we have benefited tremendously for his wisdom and rich experience. We all wish him a very successful tenure, long tenure, and also help and guidance to the academia. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I request sir to take over the session and benefit all of us. Thank you.
To thank Institute of Public Enterprise, specifically Professor Nisarg, for giving me a chance to come back here. I must say that I'm coming back home because this is the institute where I started my career. I joined the Institute of Public Enterprise way back in almost a quarter of a century ago. It was February of 1986, and I worked here continuously until 1991, the economics group, which was very vibrant, and we were particularly fortunate in having very senior colleagues like Professor Misra, who I'm so amazed that he is such a consistent man in terms of his warmth and cordiality, because he continues to be in the same physical size and behavioral terms over the last 30 years. There's no change at all in him. He's extremely warm and welcoming and friendly to very young research scholars. And although he did financial management in an area in which at that time there wasn't that much research and so on, but he's the one person from the management side who has been very actively promoting research. And he interacted very closely with the economics group here, which was a very wonderful group at that time. So I'm very, very pleased and privileged to be here. And I must say that the foundations of my research on various aspects of technology issues in India was actually laid here. And in fact, the very same room, I'm so intimately connected because this used to be the library of the old IPE. And we were very fortunate in having some very wonderful librarians here at that time. I don't know whether Sunita is still here, I don't know. And we were also very fortunate in being able to contribute to the library in terms of a large number of books on issues related to technology and indeed public sector. So I think I'm very immensely pleased to be here, especially when I am now in an increased responsibility at my own center. Now, I'm going to speak about certain dimensions of India's innovative activity. Although my talk is titled by Professor Misra as innovations in South India, and because I thought he try to synchronize my talk with the first Southern Social Science Congress. And so one of the first things that I'm going to do is to show that a lot of innovation which is happening in India is actually happening in South India. Okay? And in fact, I'm going to use some data to show that that's indeed the case. So when I'm talking about India, we are essentially talking about South India because, as you know, large number of important scientific institutions itself, for instance, the Indian Space Research Organization, which have had a major success in terms of both designing and launching satellites and satellite launch vehicles and satellites, is also headquartered in the south. And in fact, I'll give you some interesting numbers on those. So the way I'm going to do it, I'm going to go down because I prefer to operate my own slides rather than being operated by someone else. Economic activity in this country is very much concentrated in certain states within the country. It's not as if the whole India, whenever we talk about whole India, we are essentially talking about various enclaves. So that's the first thing that I want to talk about. Thereafter, I will take you through 6 dimensions of innovative activity in India. Starting with India is one of the most major scientific nations in the world. I'll give you some, that's in terms of science, production of science, because we need to make a distinction between technology and science, and also innovation and science. In the area of science, we seem to be having a lot of plus points, and I'll give you just basically 2 instances of it. Then the next one is an important thing, which is a lot of the innovations in India are actually done by manufacturing enterprises, essentially in the private sector. Okay? Gone are the days of government being an important performer of innovation activity, and this doesn't seem to be clearly understood. This doesn't necessarily mean that government does not have a role. Government does have an important role in terms of financing and providing a kind of ecosystem for us, the innovation specialists, for the innovation system for business enterprises to operate. So that's the first one, and this has been done through a huge program of subsidy from the government to the private sector. And India has one of the most generous R&D tax regime with respect to the performance of R&D, anywhere in the world. Although the current finance minister, and rightly so, seems to be making it less generous because of certain reasons. I'll go into that as I proceed with that one. The next one is industry-wise distribution of innovative activities, also very much concentrated. So when we are talking about private sector enterprises, we are not talking about all private sector enterprises. And when we are talking about industry itself, we are not talking about all industries. It's only about 3 or 4 major industries that we are talking about. So the basic essence of my talk is to show how concentrated these various kinds of science and technology activities in our country is. The next is India has one of the most globalized R&D regimes in the world, which is again not understood, because globalization of production, as you know, the proportion of trade to our GDP has been increasing. And in fact, if you have read the latest economic survey, you would see an interesting figure where the trade to GDP ratio of India is actually even higher than China, for instance. China is supposed to be much more liberalized and open. That's what we thought. But increasingly, it is the case. And in fact, in the case of innovation production, we seem to be much more globalized than in terms of production itself. And so that's the next one is India has also become a hub for what is called frugal innovations. This term is much maligned because it's never defined properly. It's described variously by different people in different ways. But I tend to give a kind of a rigorous definition to what is called frugal innovations. And my argument is that a lot of the frugal innovations that we talk about are actually coming from the organized manufacturing sector and not from non-governmental organizations or individual inventors. Because there is a big difference between what you call as innovations and what you call as inventions. Because innovations are those inventions which are available in the market for you and me to buy. So if a particular individual has a specific problem and he sort of conjures up a kind of a specific solution to that problem to satisfy at a particular point in time, that doesn't really become and we attach the term jugaad or an improvisation to it. That is not innovation for the simple reason that most of those artifacts are simply not available in the market for you and me to buy. Whereas in the case of a mobile phone, it is available for you and me to buy by paying a price. So there are certain characteristics of proven innovations which we need to understand. I'll take you through those. And lastly, and strange though it may sound, all of a sudden India has become a major player in certain areas of high technology. Okay, for instance, aerospace. We have now become a kind of a major exporter of aerospace products. And in fact, I would argue that, and when we talk about aerospace, you have two separate industries within it. One is aeronautical, which is basically the design and manufacturing of aircraft, and the second one is astronautical and satellites. Now, I would like to tell you or prove to you that in the latter case, in astronautics, we are doing extremely well. And we have made much incremental improvements over a long period of time, etc. and so on. But what I'm trying to tell you is a counterintuitive factor that in aeronautics, we seem to have become a major exporter. In fact, India has become now the 7th largest exporter of aeronautical products from basically components and spare parts of aircraft. We are not making any aircraft by itself, but we are making components and spare parts of aircraft. And we have become the 7th largest. In fact, when you take ratio of India's exports of aeronautical products to China's exports of aeronautical products, the ratio is greater than 1. In fact, if you take ratio of India's exports of any manufactured product to China's exports of any manufactured product, the ratio is close to 0. We are sort of exporting nothing compared to China in large number of products, but aeronautical, which is an area of very high technology, we seem to be doing better than China. How does one explain this? How does one explain this? So basically what we are trying to see, the basic theme that is going to come out of my lecture is that everything is concentrated around islands of successes and the kind of dualistic economy that we are talking about has now become much more dualistic over a long period of time. So let me start with the first point, which is about why I am saying that when I talk about innovations in India, I am essentially talking about innovations in South India. Because if you look at concentration of so you look at various indicators. Okay, the first thing that you would look at is, as an economist, if you want to look at the level of economic activity, manufacturing activity, is to look at the share of manufacturing value added. Now you take production of science and technology. Okay? There are various ways of measuring this. One simple way of measuring this is to look at the input for creating new science and technology activities, which is largely done through R&D. Okay? You do research and development, then you come out with a new product or a process, and so on. So by counting the amount of money that is spent on R&D, and that's increasing over time, then you would say that the country or the sector or the firm is becoming much more innovative. Now, in R&D is also concentrated in a few states in the country, and it's not as if it's across the board, etc. So, then R&D expenditure as a measure of innovative activity is sometimes not liked because not all R&D projects results in new products and processes. A lot of R&D is actually sometimes just inquiry and so on. It may not have any kind of tangible output at the end of the day. So that figure that tend to overestimate. If you are going to measure innovation in terms of R&D, tend to overestimate. So people think patents. Patents are issued to the when you come out with a new product or a process, you would like to take an intellectual property right over it. And governments across the world have given rise to this patent system as a way of incentivizing R&D. That is, if you have a kind of a temporary monopoly over a certain period of time, then that would encourage you to commit more resources to R&D, because if I do R&D and come out with a new product or a process or a new paper, and if you are going to cut and paste it or copy it, then my desire to write a new paper in the next period will go down. Okay. Now, to prevent that, we have copyrights. So copyright is one form of intellectual property right. So if you cut and paste, and then you see that you can get away with murder, then that's one of those days. because especially after the TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights, which have been implemented very vigorously since 2005, India signed to it and implemented it from 2005 onwards. These IPR regimes are now being much more strict. Now, patent is also a form of intellectual property right, like copyrights. It is given for disappointing technology which is created by firms and so on. So, if you look at the patent, the number of patents which are granted, that is also concentrated in a few states in India. It's not as if the whole country has become, a large number of patents are actually happening. The last one is foreign direct investments. Now, I take foreign direct investment because that is an important conduit through which state-of-the-art technology is received by a developing country like India. Now, in our own country, we know that since 1991, we had a very active policy of promoting foreign direct investments. And this has now been liberalized, and especially since September of 2014 with the Make in India program, we see that a large number of areas have been thrown open, including defense production, for instance, which have been largely concentrated in the city of Hyderabad, etc., is now being thrown open to foreign direct investments. Because the idea is that foreign companies possess state-of-the-art technologies. So if you invite them to come and operate from your country, you can get some new technologies from foreign companies. Now, foreign direct investment is also concentrated in a few states in the country. Okay, so it's not as if India is attracting a large amount of. So a lot of these are actually concentrated. Now, what are the numbers? About 24% of the manufacturing value added, 26% of the R&D, 33% of the patents, and 33% of the foreign direct investment is just concentrated in the southern states of, excluding my own state of Kerala, because Kerala doesn't come anywhere in the picture for any of these. So it's basically concentrated in the three southern states, and so on. And I already mentioned that some of the major R&D organizations, for instance, the Defense Research and Development Organization, the ISRO, etc., and so on, are largely based also in the south. Okay, and in fact, the difference between the south and the north. Now, I don't have any ulterior motives here. I'm just stating the facts here. Has been increasing. So, if you do a kind of a map of India, okay, so this is a map of India. And you can see that all those green areas are where a lot of the economic activity and innovation activities are actually happening. And in fact, most of the firms are also actually located in these areas. So Maharashtra seems to be one of the most important states, although you may not strictly call that the south, but that's one of the states where a lot of these activities are happening. So, and Karnataka and Hyderabad and Tamil Nadu. And Kerala, of course, is kind of an exception to the southern states. There's not so much of production activities. There are some public sector research organizations and so on. So when I'm talking about India, I'm essentially talking about South India. So this is the first point that I'm trying to do. Now, if you look at the aerospace manufacturing, largely concentrated in the south with very little in the other parts of the country. So, by and large, this difference is unfortunately increasing. And you can see that even in terms of income distribution. My colleagues from development in general are looking at income distribution across the states. And as you know, after economic liberalization, this has actually increased. And the difference between the states also in terms of development. For instance, in my center, we are now in the process of arriving at a very composite measure of development across states. And it shows the high level of inequality which is actually across Indian states, especially after economic liberalization. Now, I said India is a major scientific nation in the world. Now, what is the evidence for that? The first evidence for that is India is being invited to participate in various, prestigious international projects. For instance, this facility for anti-proton and ion research. This is the latest one. And because India has always been a member of the CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, it has always been a member there. But recently, we have been invited to be a member of this select club of the facility for anti-proton and ion research in Germany. Okay, and China is also another country which has actually been invited. Now, these invitations don't come unless you have a sort of a demonstrated scientific capability in those areas. This cannot be done through contacts, and because you know someone and so on, you will be. So that's one thing. And as you know, in the CERN, the contributions of Indian scientists working in the CERN facility has been very well recognized, and so. The second point is that India is the first country to place a spacecraft in Mars, and this Mangalyaan project costed a bill of $74 million compared to a similar one which the United States NASA has sent, which was almost like 600 billion. Although the two projects, strictly speaking, cannot be compared because the Mangalyaan is a much more restrictive kind of satellite compared to the NASA one. But nevertheless, in a broad sense, I think this could be compared, and so that shows the kind of development. And this is also an instance of frugal innovation or engineering, where you are able to come out with a new technology for a product with almost all the features of that new product, but at significantly less cost. 671 million, I'm sorry, 74 million against 671 million. So that's a kind of order of difference that you have, and so. Now, the number of scientific publications from India has been increasing. Okay, and of course, if you compare ourselves with China, these numbers are nothing. Okay, because China has increased even much more and so on. And if you look at the areas in which Indian scientists are actually publishing, you find an interesting thing that most of the articles are in chemistry and in pharmaceutical research. In fact, my argument is that India's comparative advantage is actually in science-based industries. And this is because the Indian higher education system for a very long period of time produced more natural scientists than engineers and technology people. Okay? We have a bias in this country against engineering. And and of course some people are trying to give a kind of a cultural explanation to it in terms of the caste system, etc. For instance, working with machines, tools, etc. That's considered to be inferior, and so engineering was not given any kind of importance in our country for a very long period of time, and that's one of the reasons as to why we are not good in manufacturing. Okay, our size of our organized manufacturing sector is only 10% of our GDP. And if you add the unorganized sector also to it, it's about 15% of our GDP. That's about it all. So compared to about 30 to 40% by China, because China's share of manufacturing sector is actually coming down. So, and that's one of the reasons as to why we had the old manufacturing strategy, which is now given a new name in the form of the Make in India program, etc. And so on, with the target of reaching 25% of GDP by year 2022. Okay. So India's comparative advantage is in science-based industries and not so much in technology-based industries. Although recently the government has tried to reverse this by increasing the supply of engineers in the country, and I will argue later on in terms of challenges, this policy has largely failed because we have failed to produce quality engineers, and not just quality but also quantity, because the failure rates in engineering education is extremely high. Because in this country, for a very long period of time, nobody ever talked about learning outcomes, but has only been talking about the input for education in terms of enrollment ratios, etc. and so on. And so, if you look at the numbers thrown up by the recent census of by the higher education department in the Ministry of Human Resource Development in Delhi, the census of higher education has actually shown that the total number of engineers produced is only about 500,000, 5 lakhs, out of a total number of seats of 1 million, which means that 1 out of every 2 students joining an engineering college does not finish the 4-year BTech program. And the failure rates are extremely high, and this failure rate is very high for the southern states, where privatization of education has happened in a very, very significant way, including my own state of Kerala, where there has been a very large-scale privatization. Now, so science-based industries, we are very good. And I'll pick up this point again because we see that some of the industries which are doing very well in our country, the first industry that you would pick up is the pharmaceutical industry. That's much more science-based rather than engineering-based. Okay, and as you know, the pharmaceutical industry is largely concentrated in this city, and so on. You have some of India's best pharmaceutical firms which are headquartered in Hyderabad, and so on. And the other industry that you would come up with is the IT services industry, computer software industry, is also much more science-based, because computer science, we don't talk about, it's much more science-based rather than engineering-based. So that's the reason as to why we seem to be much better in science-based industries rather than engineering. Although quite recently, a kind of a shift has started taking place to some limited engineering activities, like for instance, automotive industry and so on. Now, let me start with the looking at India's performance in terms of innovation activity. I start with the R&D intensity. As I mentioned, R&D is the first measure of innovation. Okay, it's an input measure. I already told you about the limitations of it, because not all R&D is actually results in commercializable products and processes. And second is that if you look at the distribution of firms in our country, okay, if you take the size class of firms on the horizontal axis and you take the number of firms on the vertical axis and you draw the curve, then what you find is a kind of a positively skewed distribution of firms. And when you have a positively skewed distribution, what you find is that you have a large number of small firms and a small number of large firms. Okay, so the distribution of it's quite similar to an income distribution itself. Okay, and so when you have that kind of situation of a large number of small firms, these firms don't do R&D, but they may innovate. So if you are going to use R&D as a measure of innovation, you tend to underestimate the amount of innovations which are actually happening in small firms and so on. So there are these problems. Notwithstanding the problems, most economists would use the gross expenditure on R&D and divide that with the GDP and see how that is progressing over time. Okay, so that's given here. So the GERD, G-E-R-D, is the gross domestic expenditure on R&D. Okay, and that's taken as a percentage of GDP, because when you want to make a comparison with another country, you have to then normalize it for the level of economic activity. So you divide it by GDP. So that's what you have in the next column. So you can see that India's R&D intensity has barely increased. It is still less than 1. We are still devoting less than 1%. Now, I'm sorry that the figures don't go beyond 2012, and essentially because the Department of Science and Technology, which is the major organization in the country which is charged with the responsibility of doing the surveys, they do a biennial survey of R&D. This is the latest figure that they have. Now, just imagine planning for knowledge, for a knowledge-based economy with data which is 5 years old. Okay? Now, just imagine these kind of problems, because in our country, evidence-based policy making is always given a short shrift. We don't have, despite having a very highly sophisticated statistical system, the Indian Statistical Institute, etc., and so on, and making a lot of contributions to the theory of statistical knowledge, but in terms of collection and presentation of lots of data, we do have a lot of problems. And this doesn't get discussed much because there are very few students and researchers working in these kind of areas. Okay, so it doesn't get at all discussed. These kind of problems doesn't get discussed at all. And whenever people who are working in this area, talk about this to people in the Department of Science and Technology, etc., they would say that this is your problem. And so this only, you're only one person, and in a large country like this. So I think more and more students should come forward to work in these areas, and only then I think a kind of a pressure can be built. Now, compare that with China. Okay, India has virtually remained constant. The R&D expenditure to GDP has virtually remained constant, less than 1%. Now, please remember that our target was 2% of GDP by year 2006-07. 2006-07 was the target. Our target for R&D GERD to GDP ratio was 2%, but we are still less than 1%. Okay. Now the interesting story is whenever the Indian Science Congress is opened, as you know, it's a very large gathering of all scientists in the country during the month of January, and the Prime Minister is the one who actually goes and opens this congress. So when Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister, and when he was actually speaking at one of the inauguration of this, he said the target for GER to GDP ratio should be 2% by 2015-16. And somebody told him that the target was already 2% by 2006-7. His speech writers did not even look at, the fact that that was a target which was mentioned in the science technology policy of 2003. So just imagine, even the Prime Minister is not taking into account the targets. So nobody who is then actually monitoring and looking at these figures. Okay, and if you look at China, the Chinese, this, in fact, I have a graph, which is of course not given here. The Chinese, okay, you can see it from here itself. In '96, China was actually 96 and so on. China was actually worse than India in terms of GER to GDP ratio. Okay, they started from a much lower level. They had a target of 2%, and by year 2012, and you can see that they have already reached the target. Okay, they have already reached it. So Chinese have actually reached the target because economic policy making in this country, unlike Indians, they don't talk too much. And in fact, they do much more. So we are much more argumentative and all the time talking and claiming that to be a democracy and so on. But there's no democracy when it comes to policy making in the country. Okay, so that is another point which is being made. Now, if you look at the evolution of India's what is called the national system of innovation, that is the kind of sectors which support technical change within the economy. And very interesting changes actually happened between, I just give you two time points, 2000 and 2011. And as I said, you can't go beyond, you don't have the latest data, but this is what the DST, this is the latest data which the DST has. So if you look at 2000, almost like 70% of the R&D in 2000, year 2000 was done by the government, and the share of the private sector was only about 18% or so. So private sector is given in by that red mark. Okay. Now, by year 2011, the share of private sector has gone up to almost like 30%. So, and the share of the government has actually come down. So the share vacated by government has now been taken up by largely private sector, because a lot of the public sector enterprises have either been privatized or they have scaled down their R&D activities. That the share in total is not more than 5% these days. Okay? Of course, some of the large public sector enterprises like BHL, which is again the corporate R&D division headquartered here, is considered to be one of the most innovative companies in India. Okay? In terms of R&D and patents, etc. and so on. So by no means I'm saying that the public sector enterprises are not important, but the share in terms of has steadily come down as the process of privatization and divestiture has happened over the years. Now, is this model a desirable model of having large amount of R&D being done by manufacturing enterprises, and especially in the private sector? Okay, is this a desirable model? I would argue that this is actually a desirable model for the simple reason that if you look at countries which have actually innovated, for instance Japan, and to begin with, okay, which is a country which has actually caught up with the Western countries. Then subsequently Korea, okay, and now China. Okay, in all these countries, almost like 90. In Japan, for instance, 98% of the industrial R&D is actually performed by business enterprises. 98%. Okay, our figure is 30%. 30. Korea, the similar figure is 80%. 80% of the industrial R&D is actually done by business enterprises like Samsung, LG, etc., Hyundai, etc., and so on. And China, 74% of the total R&D is actually expended by business enterprises. So, when business enterprises do research, conversion of the research results into commercializable products and processes is very quick. Okay? Because you do research and then you can convert that research into new products and processes very quickly. Okay? So this whereas if research is done by research institutes and universities, and manufacturing is done by manufacturing enterprises, then trying to build a bridge between the two is always a problem. So you have this eternal conversation on university-industry linkage. Okay? And there are very few countries in the world where where this university industry linkage has been got correctly. And even when you have got it correctly, these are specific instances, and it cannot be generalized for the country as a whole. And so even in the United States and even in United Kingdom and other Western European countries, large number of universities don't have much connections with the industry. So just because an MIT or a Harvard or a Princeton has a good connection with the industry, doesn't necessarily mean that all the universities in the US has got a very good connection with the industry. Okay? So this kind of, so the locus of manufacturing and R&D will have to be in the same actor for innovation, more and more innovations to occur. And that's, so India is slowly moving to the ideal model of large amount of R&D being done by business enterprises. So yes, in fact, if you look at the government's policy, including the latest science, technology and innovation policy of 2013, the policy is actually aiming at more and more R&D to be done by the business enterprises. Now, between the business enterprises, the point that I already made, that the business enterprises consists of public sector enterprises like BHEL, HFT, etc., and private sector enterprises like Larsen & Toubro and Ashok Leyland, Tata Motors, etc. and so on. So between the two, much of it is actually by the red line. Okay, so the blue line is basically a vertical summation of the green and the red. So the red line is private sector enterprises. So they account for almost like 30% of the total R&D. Okay, so you can see that private sector is actually very important. Now, how is that? And within the private sector, one thing which is not known, which is not actually known to the Department of Science and Technology, but which has been revealed through surveys, annual surveys done by the Reserve Bank of India, okay, is that the share of multinationals in performance of R&D has been increasing. They were only about 9% of total business enterprise R&D. I'm not talking about the total GERD, but of that 30%, almost like 9% was actually done by multinational companies. Now it has gone up to almost like 30%. That means if you take 30% of that 30%, which is 9% of the total GERD, is actually done by multinational companies. Now, what are the implications of this? Now, I don't sound to be xenophobic. I'm not against multinationals doing R&D here. As you know, Hyderabad itself is a location where a large amount of FDI in R&D is going. Microsoft has set up a R&D division here, and Bangalore is again another location. Chennai is also another location where you have a large number of multinationals are actually located at R&D activities. And in fact, on the last count, there are about 13 foreign R&D centers of various sizes. The largest of them being the General Electric's GE's R&D laboratory in Bangalore, which employs 3,000 Indian engineers. Okay, and is the largest such facility outside the United States, and so on. By the way, even the Chinese company Huawei, you know, Huawei is the largest manufacturer of telecom equipments in the world right now. They have their largest corporate R&D division in Bangalore, you know, outside China, the largest. And so, when the Chinese premier came a few years ago, he didn't go to Delhi first. He flew first of all to Bangalore, and because he wanted to address the Indian engineers in Huawei, because China is taking advantage of India's capability in software for designing latest internet and other equipments, you know, which are being designed by that Bangalore facility, which has got its own campus, etc., and so on, quite recently. So the share of multinationals are increasing. Now, what are the implications of this? So, government's policy is to raise the target of GDP, R&D to GDP to 2% of GDP. Okay. Now, if that target is now going to be increasingly, sort of realized through multinational companies doing R&D, multinational companies do not have any kind of incentive to convert the output of their R&D into new products and processes within the territory of India. So they can do research in Bangalore or Hyderabad and then exploit the results of that in California or in Boston. Okay, because they have come here to take advantage of India's availability of good quality, cheap engineers, and also something which they don't tell openly, take advantage of the most generous R&D tax regime that India has, which I will talk about it later. Okay, we have the most generous R&D tax regime in the world, and so if you come and do R&D here, then the cost of your R&D will be less because you can claim that. So we give a 200% tax benefit. That means if you spent X rupees on R&D during year T, 200% of that X rupees can be deducted from your taxable income for year T. Okay? And if you are an unfortunate company not having a taxable income because you did not make a profit, our direct taxes rules allow you to carry it forward even up to 8 years. So it's a kind of a very generous tax regime that we have, 200%, and also this carry forward of 8 years, etc. and so on. And the intellectual property right arising from this R&D doesn't have to be exploited in India. Okay, so you can do research in India using Indian scientists and engineers, come out with a new product or a process, and then go and productionize that research in abroad, okay, in your home country, etc. and so on. Okay. So just to give you a kind of a simple example, it's like a guest coming to your house and getting into your kitchen, baking a nice cake, using the ingredients in your kitchen. And then when you want a piece of that cake, they will say that yes, I can give it to you. Why don't you pay for it? Okay, because there is nothing like in knowledge creation. Knowledge is, although we say that knowledge is actually a public good, but with the patents, etc., intellectual property rights, etc., and these companies are actually whatever research they are doing in India and coming up with an output, they are immediately taking an intellectual property right over it. Okay, to prevent it getting spilled over to other people, etc. and so on. And of course, there can be some spillovers. For instance, these R&D centers can collaborate with Indian universities and research institutes. In that process, there can be some spillovers. It can also happen that a person working for Microsoft India, after a few years, goes out of Microsoft India and takes with him some ideas which he has learned while he was working on Microsoft India, and then he sets up his own company and then uses the knowledge which he has got. Okay, so those kind of spillovers can happen, but they are far and few, and we really do not have any kind of quantitative evidence of it. And so the last time I made a presentation, somebody was telling that Texas Instruments has got a very large R&D division in Bangalore. In fact, it was the first foreign R&D center in India. It was set up in 1985. And many people from Texas Instruments have actually moved out and set up their own companies, etc. and so on. But when I did a kind of research on those companies, what I found was that a lot of those people were fired from Texas Instruments. Okay? Because no one will leave a multinational company just like that. Okay? Because of the very good incentive, financial incentive package, and also the possibility of moving up the the ladder, etc. They're much better in a multinational organization than an Indian organization. And you see, whenever they move, of course, you do have some instances, but these are anecdotal, and you can't use anecdotes to prove a point.